Welcome to another episode of Go FUD Yourself. Today is my favorite topic, the crypto arms race, and I have special guest Patrick from Arrow Markets. How you doing, Patrick?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
I know that you've been on the show before, but have you had to do the crypto arms race before?
I think I have done the crypto arms race. It is actually one of my favorite themes.
What is your expertise on the crypto arms race? Are you involved in international geopolitics?
I am absolutely not involved in international geopolitics, but I like thinking about these types of competitive forces and kind of how the implications of these different policies can play out in a competitive manner. So I think it's a very interesting kind of angle.
I also don't have a master's in international geopolitics or how they impact finance, but I do like to be really loud about it on Twitter. So I'm glad that you can be here to parse me out a little bit. Usually JD calms me down as we fly all over the world. But today we're going to start in Canada, talking about Bitcoin mining, a bit of a carryover from yesterday, and how some of the world is dealing with their renewable resources. For example, what Germany's doing. We're going to talk about Europe briefly, mostly Germany and France, what has been granted, what has been denied. And we'll move on over into India and then portions of Asia to see what's going on with CBDCs. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
So to get us started, are you a Bitcoin miner? Do you heat your home with your Bitcoin mining servers?
I do not.
I tried that once. It doesn't work as well as I'd hoped. But Bitcoin mining has been pretty hot lately because obviously the Biden administration is doing an emergency investigation. We talked about that yesterday if you're more interested. But BC, Canada, British Columbia, Canada has gone almost the opposite direction. So a really large lumber organization in Canada called Conifex, who typically per quarter have between 20 and 50 billion in revenue. So like not a small company, has petitioned BC Hydro, our power company, to allot them a certain amount of energy. And this has actually been denied because they don't want to reduce the amount of energy that might go towards some new Bitcoin mining operations. A little bit different than what we usually hear about Bitcoin mining. What do you think about the government getting involved in this way? Usually we see different types of regulation, but not necessarily allocations.
Yeah, I mean, it's a potentially very interesting overlap because obviously around the world, environmental regulations are very, they're very common. They're ubiquitous, frankly. And it's interesting to see the kind of overlap of regulations with respect to crypto mining, kind of feeding into the environmental regulations. My guess is there can be some advantages and disadvantages of that. You don't want to get hung up in some of, I think, the political discourse surrounding environmental regulations. On the other hand, governments have allocated enormous amounts of taxpayer money to fund various types of environmental programs, environmental credit systems, subsidies for companies that are building things that they deem to be environmentally advantageous. And so, if there's some potential for some of these mining firms to kind of tap into that, I think it's interesting. But I do think it's kind of it's a little bit of a dangerous route to go, just because of a lot of I mean, there's a huge amount of kind of politics involved with the environmental regulations, and I'm not sure how much we really want to kind of tap into that.
I think it's dangerous too, because this might be a win for crypto mining in the short term where money or where energy hasn't been allocated to someone else. But that does also set precedent that we won't be able to ask for energy to be allocated to crypto mining at a later date. So I'm surprised to see BC Hydro and just the province of British Columbia stepping back from this particular type of allocation regulation, but also maybe promising maybe a little bit more free market, or maybe it'll kill us in the end. Hard to say.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a little concerned that some of this overlap with the environmental regulation, and we've already seen some of it kind of in the zeitgeist with the discussions around, Bitcoin versus proof of stake. My concern is that it will continue to kind of apply pressure on Bitcoin mining, on proof of work operations from political interest groups, and that's kind of concerning to me.
Well, do you see carbon credits as driven by political interest groups?
Yeah, I'd say yeah. It doesn't mean they don't have utility. It doesn't mean it doesn't make sense as an interesting kind of marketplace, because I think the economics of carbon credits are very interesting. But there are certain types of political interest groups that lobby for those types of markets.
Of course. That is the other side here. So in Germany, BaFin has actually approved a carbon credit exchange that is blockchain based. This is mostly with neutral and DLT finance, but this is primarily for renewables. So this isn't touching your average everyday consumer. This isn't, you and I want to carbon offset our flights to a conference or something like that. This is if you have massive carbon and you want to prove long term and you want it on ledger that you have these carbon credits, we now have a way to do that on chain. I like seeing utility like this, but I am surprised to see them have blockchain enter when it's still such a controversial topic on its own.
Yeah. I actually really am excited by this story because this is exactly the type of use case that blockchain should be, people should be using blockchain for exactly this type of thing, for the infrastructure for an exchange, for example. Obviously, people have been pushing to kind of make this a reality in terms of financial systems, and it's been hard, particularly in the US, as we all know. But I think this type of infrastructure play is important and helps set a precedent for, these are the types of use cases for blockchain that we should all have in mind.
For a while, we were seeing Germany really lock down their use cases for blockchain. They were adding regulation after regulation, and people were worried actually that DeFi companies were going to start moving out of that Berlin crypto hub. But with news like this, and also with some of the next news that we're coming up on, like what's going on with DZ Bank, it seems like Germany is making a lot of forward progress. So with DZ Bank, which is Germany's second largest bank, it's also a bank cooperative or collective of 737 banks with over 30 million clients. They're actually looking at offering cryptocurrency investment without advisement services. And that will be one of the first of its kind in Europe. We have that in Canada. We have that in the States. I believe that we have some of that in South America, but it's not really that prevalent in Europe yet because of that regulatory stance. So I wonder what's fueling Germany to move forward with some of these riskier moves. But do you think this is a good move for a bank like DZ to make?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hope it could kind of open it up beyond the cooperatives, although it does, there are, I think you mentioned this, 737 cooperative banks. So this already has a significant kind of reach. So no, I think it's a great step.
Do you think that this will bump out other DEXs or SEXs in Germany?
That is a very interesting question. My guess is that there are different user categories. My guess is the people who are using DEXs are probably a little more degen-y. The people who are going to be able to start using their banks for crypto trading are probably new entrants. That would be my guess. So my guess would be it's a different user category, and there won't be much kind of substituting between users of DEXs and users of these cooperative crypto trading facilities. But I think it's the type of thing you need to see to start onboarding, these categories of users who are hesitant to use DEXs. There's a lot of reasons why a user would be hesitant to use a DEX if they don't know, who deployed the application. If there's no, people are used to like customer service or something, right? A DEX is a very different thing. It's largely anonymous and so forth. And so, to the extent that there are people who are hesitant to put their money in something like that, I think going through their bank is an option for them.
Right. On the one hand, I agree. People who are into DEXs deep probably really like, their bridging solutions that they've found, and they've found a really effective on and off ramp that they want to use. And they probably have one of the crypto credit cards and so on and so forth. But I also wonder if, one, the opportunity cost of not losing your money on a bridge that's no longer serviced or something like that might split our DEX category up, or our DEX user up, into true degen or sort of convenient degen. But I also wonder if something like this with Deutsche Bank, if it's going to be the first move in regulating decentralized finance for Germany. So maybe eventually you won't be able to access some of the DEXs in Germany because you have to access them through your bank. On the one hand, that opens up, like you said, a whole new category of user, people who just want to go directly through their bank, people who want that customer service. But it might also consolidate our users going forward, which is the opposite of the ethos of DeFi, but is maybe where we're going with regulation. Do you see that reflected in the States at all?
Yeah, that is very interesting. I mean, you could argue that, Coinbase is doing something similar, for example, with Base, and trying to essentially forward their users to DeFi applications on Base. They make it easy for their users by spinning up a wallet for them, and then they can use this wallet account to make transactions on applications deployed on Base. And so you do see kind of the formations of this funnel for users in centralized exchanges or banks to DeFi applications. So I think it's a great insight there. That may be a broader trend. And in fact, it makes sense along a few dimensions. It makes sense from the standpoint of business. So someone like Coinbase wanting to continue to kind of keep their users in-house. But then it also makes sense, as you mentioned, from the standpoint of regulation. It's much easier to keep track of what types of tools users have access to if you're funneling them through large exchanges or banks. I mean, there are, in the US, there's also, there's a word for them. I can't remember what it's called. People use a word for the banks that also offer crypto trading. Juno Finance is one of them. And so I think you could see kind of a similar funnel forming there, right? It's people who come in, form a bank account, set up their direct deposit and use their checking account for all the normal things that people use their checking account for. But then also they have access to some of these crypto trading services. And you could kind of, like I said, see kind of a funnel forming there. So I think it's a great point.
Yeah. I think that the funnel that we're currently seeing, though, is still just starting to gain traction in most countries. I mean, France is only now letting Coinbase and Gemini in just this week. And that's obviously because there's a proven use case of how users are going to be using their funds, how they're going to be reporting their funds. And now it's regulatorily compliant. France feels that it is safe for their citizens to finally be able to get to use these two products. So there is something to say about, about using something that we've seen work before, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, there's also something to be said about what users are looking for. I'm not sure that we will get to a point where, every user who wants to, be a trader will be comfortable with, permissionless DeFi applications. That there may be just a bound to like the fraction of the population who's comfortable with that. And, going through some of these larger licensed entities might be the only option to onboard the rest of the population.
Right. Interesting. One of the things that has come up in the news about these pretty standard, if you're in crypto, who Coinbase is, who Gemini is. These are seen as pretty standard centralized exchanges now, and they're pretty large. But something that I think is interesting is we see Gemini and Coinbase in regulatory hot water in the States, and then somehow passing regulation in France and entering that space. And sometimes I wonder if it's just geopolitics, if the French are like, well, we can do that better. Because, there has always been a little bit of back and forth between the States and France, or if this is that Gemini and Coinbase have found a way to enter France in a way that's regulatorily compliant because they've practiced doing that in the States already.
Yeah, my guess is there's some of each. I doubt there's an actual geopolitical motivation for this from France's standpoint, but there could be just business competition, though, could be a factor, right? I mean, The way that banks are structured in Europe is very different than the US. There is kind of an ongoing competition for different types of banking services for international companies between the US and Europe. And so I think this type of thing, especially if, for Gemini, some of these larger entities, I think it could be that, I won't say geopolitical, but it could be that there are international business considerations that factor in here. It's not just kind of the incremental implications of the legal proceedings, right? Because this type of announcement would have, Gemini presumably has been having to file paperwork, for years to get to this point in France. So they would have been working on this in parallel. But I also think that this, to the theme of crypto arms race, this is exactly the type of behavior you want to see that kind of catalyzes competition between countries in terms of regulation and what types of products and services they allow.
Well, the one thing that everybody seems to be able to agree on is that WorldCoin is a no-go. I don't know what your personal thoughts on WorldCoin are. I'm not a huge fan because I don't like biometrics at all. I don't have my fingerprint on my phone or anything. But so France has ousted them, Brazil has ousted them, India has ousted WorldCoin, and this is after seeing things like kiosks popping up in India where you could go put a helmet on and have your eyeball scanned. So I think this is a pretty big deal too, is saying, hey, France is willing to let people or let organizations who have some regulatory non-compliance internationally in because they are complying within France, but they're also being pretty picky about those who are not going to comply. What do you think about WorldCoin, Patrick?
Yeah, I have a different take on WorldCoin than most people. I actually think it's very interesting. I also don't think, obviously Sam Altman is involved, and so I think you want to take it seriously. I think it is a serious operation. I also think that, and this is kind of a whole nother conversation, but I'll just say quickly, I think we are heading to a point where everyone's information is available. And, everything you do is going to be recorded, whether you want people to take your biometrics or not. Your eyeballs are being scanned every time you walk into a building, when you walk down streets, when you're on public transportation, when you're in the airport, and so forth. And so I think technology, I'm bullish on technology that facilitates individuals taking control over that information. If you take as a premise that all of your information is going to be available, then you want something like WorldCoin to help you take control of that information. And I don't think WorldCoin is the exact solution for this problem, but I think this type of solution is important because I don't think these privacy concerns are going away. I think we're going to be living more and more, I don't want to say a surveillance state. I think it's just a function of how cheap it's going to be to measure and record information. And so everything you do is going to be recorded somewhere. And so the more control you have over what's done with that information, the better.
I think this is a difficult regulatory topic as well. Did you hear the Finnish news? This isn't in our brief, so I'm sorry, but did you hear the Finnish news about their National Bureau of Investigation finding a hacker and being able to prove it was him because his fingerprints were in an Instagram photo of his?
I did not.
Yeah, I'll have to send it to you. It was very interesting. I don't know all the specifics offhand, but basically they thought it was him. They were having a hard time proving it was him. He ended up leaving a fingerprint on a document, like, who hacks things and then prints stuff, but that's what he did. And so he ended up leaving a fingerprint on it, but they had no way to really get his actual fingerprints and prove it was his. But then he took a photo of his hand holding something and put it on Instagram, and they were able to match the fingerprint that way. So really anything that you already have online, as we know, is public domain. Just because you think it's private doesn't mean that it's actually private. Just because you have some sort of like block on your Instagram account or something doesn't mean that that is going to hold up in court. So I think there's this larger components to things like WorldCoin or even things like zero knowledge, where people don't realize how much information they've put out there. And that's probably very difficult for countries to regulate and to think about when they decide which organizations are going to come into their country. So even WorldCoin already was in France and India, and now it's going to be pulled back a little bit, but it's not as though the people that it's already touched don't already belong to WorldCoin, right?
Right.
Just
yeah, It's very interesting. I think this topic is going to be this topic about information and privacy, and I call it micro information, just kind of these little bits of information that individuals produce. I think this is going to become more part of the zeitgeist over the next few years.
So India itself is a pretty unique situation in terms of crypto. So we did actually think WorldCoin was going to take off really large in India. And in some ways it did. Like I said, there were kiosks where you could enter and have your scan done and talk to a representative and that kind of thing. But India has recently allowed way more sexes and dexes into the country. And this is after saying that they didn't want to have any regulatory hand on crypto at all about 2 years ago. And then about a year ago, probably influenced by BRICS, they decided that they were going to start taxing crypto, which is a pretty big deal. They actually have one of the highest rates in the world. It's about 30% right now, which is pretty high. The only ones that are higher that I found offhand were Finland, Austria, and Australia. But it looks like this is going to continue. They're looking at increasing that 30% tax on virtual assets to include a 1% tax deducted at source, which is a pretty big deal, especially when you think about all of the markets that they're involved in. But part of why they're doing this is the Indian government believes that foreign wallets, but held by Indian investors, are holding 4 billion in crypto assets. So they're trying to ensure that they get all of their pie. This was a lot of information at once, but what do you think about heavy taxes for crypto and how they might impact user adoption in countries like this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, India has been all over the place over the last few years in terms of the message from their regulators. So this is interesting. I would say, it's kind of, the high tax rates are kind of a mixed bag. I mean, obviously paying the high tax rate is undesirable, but having something taxed means it's within the scope of what you're allowed to do. So you'd rather have something that isn't if it's taxed, it means it's not illegal, right? So it's kind of a mixed bag. But I'm not sure how much. My sense is over the past few years, every time there's a big announcement about regulation of crypto in India, you hear something a few months later that's kind of the opposite message. So we've heard that they're extremely strict, and then we've also heard that they're extremely lenient, within a few months of each other. So I think the message is still fairly volatile.
I have wondered with BRICS in particular, when you look at how they're dealing with crypto taxes, crypto regulation, CBDCs, all that kind of thing, it seems like each country is taking a really different stance, but on a small scale. And I wonder if this is the large organization trialing a few different things to see what they can introduce to the whole group of countries, especially since BRICS is growing and had, I think last year, 21 countries applied to be a part of BRICS. So it would make sense that they can do these little test markets, right? But the other thing I wonder is, so we see this really high tax in India on crypto, and at the same time, India is talking about a CBDC, introducing a digital rupee. So maybe the idea here being that if you are going to participate in virtual assets, perhaps we can push you away from crypto by allowing you to enter via a digital CBDC. And it looks like Japan is moving in the same direction.
Yeah, the CBDC. Yeah. The CBDCs scare me. I think that's the typical view that people in crypto have, that the CBDCs are a little scary. There was a report by the Federal Reserve. The US looked at it pretty closely. If you haven't looked at the report by the Federal Reserve, it's actually really interesting because they do kind of carefully weigh out the advantages and disadvantages of the CBDC. I think there are a lot of advantages in terms of efficiency of having kind of a common digital currency, but I think a better solution would be some type of private implementation. So when I see Japan or India talking about CBDCs, I hope that what we will eventually see is a private implementation of a digital currency.
Interesting. India and Japan are taking slightly different routes from one another, but that doesn't mean they can't learn from each other, as they're looking at a really similar implementation time. So right now, the Reserve Bank of India is kind of driving the CBD force, or the CBDC force, but a lot of politicians and business leaders in India are saying that we should really be engaging with India's startups so that we can solve problems like privacy and user experience, which sounds like it's kind of along the lines of what you're talking about. Both India and Japan are saying, hey, we really need to have more discussions. We need to do more work. We need to try small scale experiments and see what is going to work. But both of them have a pretty positive stance that this is going to happen, with Japan looking at discussing it until at least 2026 and then looking for implementation as early as 2030. So that still feels like a long ways out, but it's not really that far.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, in America, Trump says that he will never allow for a CBDC.
Interesting.
I don't know if you want to comment on that, but that's what he said.
Yeah, Trump says a lot of things. I believe him that we won't see it if he becomes president again. We won't see it while he's president. I believe that. But
that's a good way to put it. I think sometimes, though, you can't really stop some of these larger forces. So just to wrap up our discussion on CBDCs, the UAE and China have moved $13.6 million cross-border in a single CBDC transaction last week. So this is a pretty big deal. They dealt with the Bank for International Settlements. They used Enbridge. They talked to Chainlink about it. This was in theory to showcase the potential for digital currency trade cross-border. And I guess that is one of the use case scenarios of CBDC. But for the most part, we think about it as a retail solution as opposed to a commercial solution. So it's interesting to see some of these really large transactions happening in countries that aren't America.
Yeah. I mean, I think the kind of commercial solution, that's the dimension that can be, tested and implemented first from the standpoint of centralized planners. So it kind of makes sense to see this to see this tested first. The retail adoption comes after I think the commercial implementation is in place. So this makes sense. And I would just, my same concerns about CBDC that I mentioned before are, kind of relevant here as well. I'd say, I seriously doubt that in the U.S. we would see a centralized CBDC like this. I would recommend any of the viewers that haven't looked at the Federal Reserve report from the U.S. on CBDCs. It's really interesting and comprehensive. I recommend it.
Awesome. Well, that is the crypto arms race in a nutshell. I know there's lots more going on in the world, but in a half hour, we've covered what we could. We talked about Germany, we talked about France, we talked about Canada, we talked about the States, India, Japan, UAE, China. It's been a pretty broad episode, everything from carbon offsets to CBDCs. Patrick, do you have any closing thoughts? Anything else you think people should read to stay up to date on the crypto arms race?
No, I don't. But I think you guys should keep doing the crypto arms race, and I'll stay tuned in.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Patrick. And with that, I say, go FUD yourself.